Did you know Queen Elizabeth I only bathed once a month, if that? Step back in time with Time Whispered as we uncover the top 5 most shocking and downright disgusting hygiene habits of one of history's most powerful monarchs. From lead-covered faces to questionable dental routines, you'll never look at royal life the same way again. If you think modern hygiene is bad, just wait until you see what passed for clean in the Elizabethan era. Stick around. You won't believe. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more strange and fascinating stories from the past. Picture this. You're standing in the most powerful court in 16th century Europe. The air is thick with perfume. The walls shimmer with gold tapestries, and everyone whispers in hushed, reverent tones. But there's something else in the air, something unsettling that no amount of rose water can quite mask. This is the story of how one woman's desperate fight against time, aging, and vulnerability created one of history's most disturbing beauty routines. A story that makes our modern obsession with filters and Botox look like child's play. I'm about to take you behind the velvet curtains of Elizabeth Tudor's court, where beauty wasn't just skin deep. It was literally skin-destroying. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll never look at royal portraits the same way again. Let's start with Elizabeth's first deadly love affair. And no, it wasn't with a man. It was with sugar. But this wasn't your typical sweet tooth. This was an addiction that would literally eat her alive. In 1558, when Elizabeth took the throne, sugar was more valuable than gold. We're talking about a substance so rare that most people lived their entire lives without tasting it. But for Elizabeth, it was everywhere. Her meals were sugar-coated fantasies, candied rose petals, marzipan sculptures, fruits dripping in syrup. Here's where it gets really dark. Elizabeth didn't just consume sugar, she worshipped it. Every meal became a ritual of sweetness, a way to prove England's growing wealth and her own divine right to rule. But here's the twist that nobody talks about in those glossy history documentaries. Elizabeth's teeth weren't just rotting, they were literally dissolving. By her 40s, foreign ambassadors wrote home describing her black and broken smile and breath so foul it made seasoned diplomats physically recoil. One Spanish envoy actually wrote that her words were hard to understand through the decay. But the most chilling part? Her court ladies began blackening their own teeth with soot and charcoal to match their queen. When royal decay becomes a fashion statement, you know something is seriously wrong with the system. Now, you might think Elizabeth's hygiene issues were just about being lazy or gross, but the truth is far more psychological and far more tragic. Elizabeth lived in constant terror. Terror of aging, terror of showing weakness, terror of being seen as human. And in her mind, water was the enemy of illusion. Think about it. Water washes away makeup, reveals true skin, shows real imperfections. For someone whose power depended on maintaining an image of divine perfection, a simple bath was like kryptonite. But there's a deeper layer here that most people miss. Elizabeth had watched her mother, Anne Boleyn, be destroyed by the court's scrutiny. She had seen how quickly royal favor could turn to royal execution. So every decision about her body became a strategic military operation. Instead of bathing, Elizabeth created elaborate rituals of fake cleanliness. She'd change her linen undergarments multiple times a day, believing the fabric would magically absorb impurities. She'd have servants dab her with rose water and vinegar, not to clean, but to maintain the performance of purity. The palace servants whispered about the smell. Even with all that perfume, even with the constant costume changes, there was an underlying odor that no amount of lavender could mask. but nobody dared speak of it. The emperor's new clothes had become the queen's phantom cleanliness, but Elizabeth's most deadly obsession was her face. And I mean that literally. Her beauty routine was slowly killing her. Every morning, her servants would begin the ritual of transformation. First, they'd apply Venetian cerussy, a mixture of white lead and vinegar that created that porcelain doll look she's famous for. But here's what they didn't know. They were essentially painting her face with poison. The white lead seeped into her skin, causing rashes, open sores, and permanent scarring. But as her real face deteriorated, Elizabeth just applied thicker layers. By her 50s, her makeup was so thick that people whispered it might crack if she smiled too wide. Then came the mercury-based lip paint. Bright red, beautiful, and absolutely lethal. Mercury poisoning causes mood swings, memory loss, trembling hands, symptoms that Elizabeth increasingly displayed as she aged. She was literally painting herself to death, one layer at a time. The psychological toll was even worse. Elizabeth banned mirrors from her private chambers because she couldn't bear to see her real face. She ordered artists to only paint her, using decades-old portraits as templates. No matter how old she got, her official image stayed frozen at age 25. In her final years, servants reported that her face had become so fragile that touching it might cause the makeup to crack and fall away. She was trapped inside her own creation, a living statue that couldn't risk being human. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or should I say, the sewage in the palace. Because behind all that gold and velvet was a reality that would make modern horror movies look tame. Tudor palaces had zero plumbing. None. The queen of the most powerful nation on earth was essentially living in a beautiful sewer. Every palace had hundreds of people, and all of their waste went into chamber pots that had to be emptied by hand into cesspit trenches. The smell was so overwhelming that Elizabeth had to move her entire court from palace to palace, not for politics, but to escape the stench. They'd literally abandon buildings when they became too rank to inhabit. But here's the part that really shows how twisted the system was. Elizabeth had a special servant called the groom of the stool, essentially a nobleman whose job was to manage her toilet time. This wasn't a lowly position. It was considered an honor because it meant intimate access to the queen. The palace floors were covered with rushes, basically like medieval carpet, that were supposed to absorb odors. But these rushes weren't changed regularly, so they became breeding grounds for rot, insects, and disease. People were literally walking on layers of accumulated filth disguised as decoration. Elizabeth's response? More perfume, more incense, more denial. She turned the palace into a scented nightmare, where beautiful smells tried desperately to mask the underlying decay. But here's what I think is the most fascinating and tragic part of this whole story. Elizabeth's bizarre hygiene wasn't about being dirty or lazy. It was about control. Absolute, desperate, pathological control. Think about it from her perspective. She was a woman in a man's world, ruling a nation that had never successfully been led by a female monarch. Every day, she was one scandal, one sign of weakness, one moment of human frailty away from losing everything. Her body became her battlefield. Every perfume, every layer of makeup, every avoided bath was a strategic decision in a war against time, against nature, against humanity itself. She couldn't control politics, she couldn't control her enemies, but she could control her image. The saddest part? She became a prisoner of her own creation. The mask she built to protect herself became the cage that trapped her. She spent decades creating the myth of the Virgin Queen, ageless, perfect, untouchable, but the cost was losing herself entirely. In her final years, she carried a scented walking stick that she'd raise to her nose when passing smelly courtiers. It wasn't just about blocking odors. It was her final act of separation, her last way of saying, "I am not like you. I am not human." Now, before we judge Elizabeth too harshly, let's take an honest look at ourselves. How different are we really? We live in an age of Instagram filters, Botox parties, and beauty routines that cost more than most people's rent. We've replaced lead paint with chemical peels, mercury with injectable toxins. Elizabeth's story isn't just about a crazy queen from 500 years ago. It's about what happens when the pressure to be perfect becomes more important than the need to be human. It's about the price we pay when our image becomes more real than our reality. The difference is that Elizabeth's performance was about political survival in a world that would literally kill her for showing weakness. Our modern beauty obsessions are often about social media likes and cultural pressure. But the psychological mechanisms are eerily similar. We're all creating versions of ourselves that we think the world wants to see. The question is, at what point does the mask become more important than the face underneath? Elizabeth died alone, her face so damaged by decades of toxic makeup that historians still debate what she actually looked like. She achieved immortality through her carefully crafted image, but lost her humanity in the process. Elizabeth Pierce wasn't just a queen, she was a master of illusion. A woman who understood that sometimes survival means sacrificing truth. Her hygiene wasn't about cleanliness. It was about power, control, and the desperate human need to be seen as more than we are. In the end, maybe that's her most timeless lesson. Not about how to rule a kingdom, but about the price of perfection and the cost of never letting anyone see who you really are underneath the crown. The Virgin Queen lives on, not because she was clean, but because she was clever enough to make her image cleaner than any soap could ever make her skin. Thanks for watching. History isn't always glamorous, and today's look at Queen Elizabeth I proves it. If you enjoyed this dive into the darker side of royal hygiene, there's plenty more where that came from. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your fellow history lovers, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a whisper from the past. Until next time, this is Time Whispered, where history speaks softly, but the stories are unforgettable.